Welcome to Texting, where we consider issues relevant to Jewish life through the lens of classical and modern Torah texts. I'm your host, Elana Stein. Hain. We're recording on Tuesday, December 3rd, 2024. If you'd like to follow along with today's text, you can find the link to our source sheet in the episode description. Earlier this year, I was sitting across from my nephew at the Shabbat table. Recently, he's been released from the IDF, but back then he was an active duty soldier who worked in tanks. And he had just spent time stationed inside and on the border of Gaza. In the middle of dinner, he said to me, pretty unprompted, "Aunt Elana, you have to tell them." And I said, "Who?" He said, "The people you teach in North America." "Okay, what should I tell them?" He said, "You have to tell them that I risked my life more times than I can count for the sake of Gazan civilians." I was really humbled by the whole interaction, because here I was sitting next to my nephew, who's half my age, and who's seen things and risen to challenges that I couldn't even understand. So I just said to him, "I will." The conversation ended there. I didn't ask him why he did that, whether he thought that's what others did, or why he wanted me to tell people. The interaction itself was intense enough. But it dawned on me that part of what he was telling me was how he saw himself in war and how he thought others might see him. In processing the horrors of war and the trauma that we walk away with, we begin to perceive who we have been in war amidst all that has happened. You know, Hanukkah tells the story of a Jewish military success against seemingly impossible odds. And the way that Jews are supposed to think about ourselves in this story is very clear. We're a ragtag, small band of scrappy fighters. We're the weak who overcome the strong, the victimized who were able to rise above. Now that we're experiencing another major moment of Jewish military might in real time, and thank God for the ceasefire in Lebanon, let's hope it holds, how do we think about ourselves? Before the liturgy gets written to tell us how to think about ourselves. This question of self-perception when fighting a war is also related to the perception of the other. How am I different from my enemy? And to what extent? This might be a collective question of national and institutional comparisons, or it might be an individual question. Who am I and who is the enemy fighter across from me? And probably most starkly, who is the enemy non-combatant caught in the chaos? Who am I in relation to them? A midrash that speaks to this, who are we and who are they? Who am I and who are you? Is found in Bereshit Rabbah, 99, section 2. The context is a discussion of much of the animal imagery found in the blessings that Yaakov, Jacob, gives his sons at the end of the book of Bereshit, Genesis, and the blessings that Moses, gives the 12 tribes of Israel at the end of Devarim, Deuteronomy. I'm looking forward to taking a look at this with Christine Hayes. Hi, Chris.
Hi.
I think you're always helpful in giving us an overview of big phenomena that happen in rabbinic and biblical literature. So because we're going to see this animal imagery approach, can we just start with that question? You know, when the Bible uses animal imagery, and even when Chazal, the rabbis, do, what do you make of it?
Yeah. Well, animals have many different literary uses in the Bible and in rabbinic literature, but one prominent use is to represent nations or kingdoms. And we do the same thing today, right? America is often represented by an eagle, Russia is represented by a bear. And when that happens, the characteristics of the animal are being applied to the kingdom or the nation in question. So this is why many people are glad that Ben Franklin didn't win and we aren't represented by a turkey, right? But it tells us something about their nature. So in Devarim and in Deuteronomy 28, Moses says that if the people break the covenant, God's going to bring a nation from afar which will attack as the eagle swoops down on its prey. So he likens the punishing enemy nation to an eagle swooping down on its prey, and that conveys the idea that this nation will be swift and unstoppable and direct and ruthless. It might be that an imaginary animal is used to represent a nation. We have a leopard with 4 heads and 4 wings in the book of Daniel, Daniel representing Persia. Same
Sounds
thing
like
today.
something my kids would
Would draw.
would doodle in class.
Exactly. And we have the same thing today, right? China is represented as a dragon, right? Not a real animal. But in general, when an enemy kingdom is represented as an animal in the Bible, it will be represented as a predator or a beast, right? It's an enemy. Animals are also used to represent individuals, especially heroic figures within Israel. So a noble, a wealthy person might be described as a bull. That was a positive representation. And so Jacob, when he blesses his sons, he's going to liken several of them to animals, usually positive. Yisachar is a strong-boned ass. Naphtali is a hind, which bears lovely fawns. But sometimes it's negative. Dan is a serpent or a viper who bites the heels of horses, so they throw off their riders. I think things get really interesting when an animal has both positive and negative qualities. How do we know which qualities are being ascribed to the kingdom or the person who's being compared to the animal? And of course, it could be a mix. The character of a person or a nation can be ambiguous. And so this is what we'll see in our Midrash. We're going to see a kind of a lining up of certain figures within Israel who are represented by an animal, with an enemy kingdom that's represented by the same animal. And the Midrash wants to make sense of that coincidence. What does it mean that this Israelite figure or hero is represented by an animal that's also used to represent an enemy kingdom?
Right, so the confrontation is there's a mirror that's already set up. Okay, great, let's dive in. That's super helpful. This Midrash, it's going to begin by setting the stage for the blessings of Jacob and Moses to actually be mapping out the future confrontations within Jewish history. So it starts, this is Bereshit Rabbah, Ki lo ya'aseh Hashem Elokim davar, etc. It's a verse from Amos, chapter 3, verse 7, that God won't do anything without letting God's prophets know. So what we're about to see is Yaakov ziveg shnayim keneged shnayim, Jacob in his blessings matched up two of his sons with two future empires that would confront the Jewish people. And Moshe ziveg shnayim keneged shnayim. And likewise, Moses did the same. Two of the tribes in his blessings are each going to be matched up with a confronting empire. Right? So the implication here is kind of God wants them to know ahead of time. And maybe there's an element of, well, bless your children or your tribes to be able to be the mirror image of those confronting empires in order to survive or to triumph even.
Right, to equip them for that destiny.
Right. Okay, so let's start with the first. The first is Judah. I mean, many people know Lion of Judah, right? So Judah corresponds to the kingdom of Babylon, the kingdom that destroyed the first temple, just parentheses for people to know.
Mm-hmm.
They're each compared to a lion in the Bible. Judah was compared to a lion in Jacob's blessings, right? Judah is a lion cub, Gur Aryeh Yehuda. And Babylon is likened to a lion in the book of Daniel, right? In the description, and Chris, you'll give us a little more on this on Daniel 7, the first kingdom that's described in Daniel 7 was like a lion, and we say that's Babylon. So into the hands of whom will the lion of Babylon fall? Into the hands of Daniel, who is a descendant of the lion Judah. So give us a little bit on Daniel 7 for a minute before we look at these mirror images.
Yeah, just in case we had trouble following that at home. So in Daniel 7, Daniel has a vision of four beasts in sequence. First this winged lion, and then a bear, and then a four-headed, four-winged leopard, and then a small beast who has lots of horns. And it's explained to him that these each represent a world empire. It's sort of the sequence of history. The Babylonians are the lion, the Medes are represented by the bear, the Persians are represented by this odd leopard, and the Greeks are the beast, with the horns being the many kingdoms that come from the Greeks. So Yehuda is symbolized as a lion, but so is this enemy kingdom of Babylon. And the Midrash is saying that's no accident. It will be a descendant of Judah, Daniel, who will defeat the Babylonians.
Okay, but here I'm already seeing our enemy's a lion, so we have to be a lion to defeat the enemy.
Right.
So who wants to be a lion? Right? This is not some abstract question. It's a question of how we need to think of ourselves in order to be able to fight, like in order to be able to make war. A lion may be majestic, but it's also scary and violent, and it's a predator. But the only way to beat a lion is to be a lion. And I think it's actually very sad that when Yaakov is blessing his sons, he has to think about there needing to be lions in the future.
Right.
In order to triumph.
Right. And maybe that's why the lion that Daniel is a little bit different from the lion that the Babylonian king is, right? I mean, the Babylonian king is a lion in the sense that he is this sort of fierce military head of an empire that has, conquered and destroyed Israel and the temple. Daniel is a lion in a different sense. So he gets the better of the Babylonian king, but not through those means or techniques, right? So that's what's they're similar, but there's also a difference here, and that's what's important. So in the story, we know that Daniel correctly recounts and interprets the king's dream, Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and so he's rewarded by being made governor. He later predicts the fall of Nebuchadnezzar's son, Belshazzar, and then when Belshazzar is killed, the new king appoints Daniel as one of 3 who rule the entire kingdom, right? So the point is that Daniel doesn't really go to battle in the military sense. He's not a lion quite in that sense, but he certainly defeats Babylonian kings and wields authority over the kingdom. So he's a lion, but it's as if they're going out of their way to say, yes, he's a lion, but he's a different kind of lion, right? He's not the fierce militaristic lion that is Babylon.
Right, and maybe that goes to the ambiguity or the Janus-faced possibilities of particular animals, right? It can be valiant. So it's so interesting as a parent of boys. So I'm always intrigued what people are writing about masculinity. I really, really am, right? Because I don't relate to it the way that my kids relate to it. And I saw a great article a while back. I can't remember who wrote it. And she was talking about the problematic of just using toxic masculinity as a term without figuring out an affirmative term for masculinity. Because what she was saying is, you've got this physical strength. You actually do have physical strength.
Yes.
And if we don't figure out a way to talk about how you use that physical strength, then all we're doing is trying to negate that physical strength. And so what she suggested was heroic masculinity. And I'm kind of reminded I'm reminded of that by trying to say, yes, you're going to have to be a lion, but what is it going to mean to be a lion? And obviously it's not lost on me that Daniel is thrown into the lion's den, right? And emerges as a lion, right?
Exactly.
Meaning and it's not lost on me either, by the way, the lion imagery that's used for the state of Israel either.
Sure.
Right? Meaning it's supposed to be, we're strong, you can't mess with us, but the hope is that there's a valiance there. There's
the
a
hope is that it's not
there.
the predatory lion. All right.
Correct. And that we want to do. But let's move to another image that I think is, I want to see how you spin it. I think it's harder to spin because it's a wolf. Okay.
Yeah.
And even the way that it's described is like tearing, literally, right? So the next part of the Midrash, Binyamin keneged Malchut Madai, Benjamin corresponds to the Medes. Zen imshal beze'ev, v'zon imshala beze'ev. They're both compared. They're each compared to a wolf, okay? Where do we see Benjamin compared to a wolf? In Bereshit chapter 49, in Jacob's blessing. Binyamin ze'ev yitraf. Benjamin is a wolf that mauls, right? That's certainly very violent imagery, right? And what about the Medes? Back to Daniel 7. What's interesting is that the verse that's quoted in Daniel 7, and this you can always count on and enjoy the Midrash, the verse that is quoted from Daniel 7 makes it sound like, and it's Aramaic, the word dove instead of the word ze'ev, the word for bear instead of the word for wolf. And then, of course, Rabbi Hanina says, it might be written as dove, which is bear, but it's actually Dave, which is like ze'ev, which is wolf. And then they quote Rabbi Yochanan, with another verse in Jeremiah 5:6 to make sure that we know the Medes are wolves, okay? Not bears, right? But regardless, this is even more obvious, right? We're talking about wolves plundering.
Yeah.
Right? Talking about wolves plundering, but who is going to be our wolf who's going to overtake the Medes? Really, what we would think of probably as the Persians. Like we think more Persians than Medes because we think Purim. So we say, okay, in whose hand is the Medes, the Median. Do I say Median? Median?
Sure.
They're not here to correct me,
That's
Chris. Right? The Median kingdom going to fall in the hands of Mordecai. And other versions had the hands of Mordecai and Esther, who come from the tribe of Benjamin. Right? Mm-hmm. I just think, yes, it's definitely true. Similar to what you said about Daniel, it's not like there's, they're doing the military work. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
They do lead to some military
plenty of violence
on the part of the Jews.
Yeah,
right?
Plenty of violence, yes.
Like a wolf.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
And in some ways, it actually is the perfect image, I have to say, because it isn't like some military formation or something where we might at least be able to claim that there's some sort of orderly procedure or a declaration of war and soldiers come out and do battle. No, I mean, this is really like a plundering wolf, the slaughter that happens at the end of the book of Esther. So it's actually not a bad metaphor for what happens. So yes, like Daniel, who does defeat Nebuchadnezzar by gaining power and authority, Mordecai and Esther kind of defeat the Medes by having this position of power and authority. But in this case, we really do have some pretty powerful violence in the book of Esther as well. Yeah, so it raises that question even more pointedly. What does one become sometimes when confronting a certain kind of enemy?
Well, so I think that's, to me, this first half of the Midrash really is pushing on the question of how do you differentiate yourself from an enemy who you have to use violence. Sometimes you have to use violence, but how do you not become that? And I have to say, I go right to this war. I have an old friend who's become just virulently anti-Israel. And recently this person posted how they think it's wrong that Israel and Jews talk about our soldiers as soldiers, but talk about their soldiers as terrorists. And I was very troubled because I actually think it's essential to do so. It's essential to distinguish between people who fight to protect and have some code of military ethics that they are accountable to, and those who fight to harm civilians purposely and have no code of ethics. So even when I have to be a wolf, I'm not like that other wolf. And I think the distinction between the two, I mean, we can't just become moral relativists and say, oh, just because in your own mind you think of yourself as a soldier, right? There has to be some sort of moral code that you can actually look at and say, there are wolves and then there are wolves.
Right.
Right.
That doesn't mean I have to accept that representation uncritically.
Okay, so we've got Judah and Benjamin, lion and wolf. The Midrash is definitely setting up the possibility of being similar, right? And to my mind, that sort of pushes the need to distinguish both in deed and in description, right? But now the Midrash is going to move from Jacob's blessings to Moshe's blessings. And you want to give us a little bit of an intro of how it's going to feel different?
Yeah, and I will also just say before doing that in comment that this is kind of sneaking up on us, right? The first one where Judah is a lion and you have the Babylonians as a lion, and so they're defeated by a lion, and it's really Daniel sort of outsmarting and right. That somehow seems to make a certain amount of sense, and it's a poetic kind of justice. But we start to feel a little disturbance when we realize in the second example how Mordecai, in order to defeat the Medes, does take on certain behaviors that begin to bother us a little bit, right? So it's going to be this creeping sense. And I think that the Midrash as a whole, we're going to go through 4 examples. We are going to get this increasing sense that perhaps there's been greater and greater compromise of the character of the Israelite or Jewish character as we move through. So the first one, not so much, but the second one, a little bit more. And by the time we get to the end, I think we're going to have an even bigger question, bigger moral issue.
And I always have the anxiety because I have so many people who I know and love who are part of this war and who I'm so incredibly proud of for their courage, that I just want to make sure that even as we're having a conversation about the possibilities of becoming something that you don't want to become, this is not, this is actually in the name of morality. It's in the name of being who we are. And being our best selves is to actually think about how no one is immune from
Elana,
these possibilities.
The very anxiety indicates that there is a resistance to it, right? The very fact that it is something that rabbis express a certain anxiety about, and the fact that soldiers today express anxiety about it is the sign of a healthy moral barometer, right?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that.
And the shift that's going to happen here is that the Midrash is telling us that what we see here is a certain proof of prophecy, right? If Amos said God reveals his plans to his prophets, he's letting them know that things will happen in the future. And we see that in Jacob's blessings of Judah and Benjamin, which attributed them the characteristics of a lion and a wolf because of their destiny to defeat kingdoms, or a descendant of theirs would defeat the kingdoms that are also represented as a lion and a wolf. But now we switch. There's another way to signal that the destinies of an enemy nation and an Israelite figure are intertwined, not by likening them to the same animal, right? So Moses also signals a certain connection, not using animal imagery. He's going to signal the connection just basically through what we think of as a compare and contrast exercise, right? These two things have something that seems to link them and make them similar, but when we then bring them together to compare them, we realize that there are many things that actually contrast them. So he's going to show that there's some Israelite figure and an enemy nation that share some quality that justifies our bringing them together to link them. But when we compare them, we actually see that they're quite different. The first case is going to be quite different, but the last case we'll look at will be like a mirror opposite difference, a really extreme difference, right? But the difference is why the Israelite figure or their descendant is able to prevail in the confrontation between the two, right?
Yeah. All right, let's see it. So first we have Levites, not compared to an animal, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Levites, Levi is Keneged Malchut Yavan. It's supposed to be corresponding to Greece. Why? Zeh Shevet Shlishi. Levi is the third child, third tribe. Vizo Malchut Shlishit. And the Greeks are the third of the big empires to come against us. Zeh Otiotav Mishulashin. Levi has 3 letters. Vizo Otiotea Mishulashin. And Yavan, Greece, has 3 letters. I feel like I'm getting into a gematria Dvar Torah now. Okay, but then this is where the similarities are, not that they're going to end, but that they're going to sort of like go off the deep end a little bit. So Elu Tok'ei Kornaim, these, the Levites, they are going to, they blow horns in the Mishkan, in the Mikdash, in the temple. Ve'elu Tok'ei Sol Pirim, right? Which I think you're going to tell us that's not actually the word, but the Greeks, they also blow horns, but they're blowing horns for war, right? The Levites, they also wear special hats. We're really probably talking about the Kohanim, turban. The priests, wearing a turban. Thank you, turban. This is why you learn with your teacher, right? So these are wearing turbans, meaning probably the Kohen's special, the priest's special turban to serve again in the Mikdash, the temple. Ve'elu lovshei kisim. And these other guys, they are wearing helmets. Again, you're going to tell us it's a different word, right? That is the word. We'll include this all in the show notes for you rabbis who are going to use this, right? And these are wearing helmets for military. Elu lovshei michnasayim. These wear special pants. Ve'elu lovshei, let's see, pemilalia. You're going to tell us that's wrong as well, right? And these are wearing other like military pants. But the point is, all the clothes, this is for service in the temple, and this is for service of vanquishing humans. And then, you've been waiting for Hanukkah, here it is. Elu mirubin be'uchlusin, they have a lot of people, the Greeks. Ve'elu mu'atin be'uchlusin. And the Levites, and again, I think we might be talking about priests here, they are few in number. Ba'u merubim, the many in number, the Greeks, came v'naflu biyad mu'atin, and they fell to the few. This is exactly the Hanukkah, right? This is the Hanukkah reversal. And through what merit? How were they able to win? Through the blessing of Moses. Because Moses in Dvarim 33 says about the Levites that the Levites should be able to take down those who come against them. So in the hands of who does Yavan, Greece, fall? In the hands of the Hashmonaim, who are from the tribe of Levi. This is a totally different compare and contrast, as you said.
Yeah. But there isn't a lot of moral reflection in this. It's almost like, oh, how interesting. They wear hats and they wear hats. They wear pants, they wear pants. But their pants are the kind you wear for cavalry on riding on a horse. And their hats are helmets. And so it all indicates that this person is a soldier. This nation is coming out to war, but this nation is worshiping in the temple. Implicitly, there's an idea that perhaps warfare is not as positive as
right, not
serving God
ideal
in the temple. But we
not
don't
ideal.
have a sense of sort of morally corrupt individuals, right? We have some sense of just this nation who's coming to conquer, and they have a match. They've met their match in the priests somehow. Again, it's about kind of a symmetry, a poetic justice, and it's just not quite the moral.
So you know what? Let's get to the moral. Let's get to the last part of the midrash, and then I want to talk about the underdogs and the the smaller against, because the last one, and this is don't get confused by the fact that Chris didn't mention Rome before when talking about Daniel 7. Go with the midrash, okay? Yosef keneged malchut Edom. Joseph lines up with Edom. Edom is Rome. Edom is Esav, okay? Why? Because they both have horns. In Dvarim, Deuteronomy 33, the description of Joseph, he is the firstborn bull, right? And has horns. And in Daniel 7, there is Edom has 10 horns on its head. And now we get moral divergence.
Right.
Okay?
Again, that's a technique to bring the two together, to justify comparing them, precisely to show their difference. Right?
So here we go. We've got Joseph and we've got Rome. What do we know about Yosef? Ze perash min ha'erva. Yosef stays away from Potiphar's wife, right? V'zenidbak be'erva. But Edom, Rome, and you'd have to look a little earlier in Bereshit Rabbah to see this, but Esav is accused of all sorts of sexual licentiousness. Zechas al kvod aviv. Joseph gives his father honor. Where his father sends him to find the brothers, they hate him. He goes anyway. But what about Esav, who's Edom? V'zeh biza al kvod aviv. This one essentially scorns his father's dignity. Again, earlier in Bereshit Rabbah, when he tells his father to stand, to eat his food, maybe when he says, my father eventually is going to die and then I'll kill my brother, whatever it is, right? Zek tiv bo, when it's talking about Joseph, et ha'elakim ani yareh. It says, I fear God. Zek tiv bo, but about Amalek, also affiliated with this whole Edom, Esav trilogy here, velo yareh elokim, right? Not God-fearing. In whose hands should Rome fall? Obviously, it should be in the hands of one anointed from Joseph's line. The moral differences are black and white, very clear. Now, what would you say?
Yeah, no, we've moved into different territory, right?
Yes.
So Rome is represented here really as the mirror image. I mean, what are the things that a Jew should die rather than do, right? Commit acts of sexual immorality, murder and bloodshed, right? And that's what Esav is accused of. That's the Midrash makes that very clear, that this is who he is and what he is. So Rome, who's represented as Esav, who is also represented, by the way, in very animalistic terms. He's described in the Midrash as eating like an animal, shoving food down. So again, we kind of have an animal idea hovering in the background here to represent this moral corruption. But Rome is the negation of everything that the rabbis value, everything that they see as essential to who they are. Rome is different from the other world empires. And just to harken back to what you said before, there are different ways of decoding the four nations. So in Daniel, at the time Daniel was written, it was really before Rome. So there's the biblical decoding that we see ending with Greece. But the rabbis are starting already to see the third kingdom as Greece and the fourth kingdom as Rome. So they are definitely, they have a different standing in the eyes of the rabbis from other empires, not just because they, destroyed the second temple. The Babylonians had also destroyed the first temple. But the rabbis really understood the Romans as a special kind of threat and as a rival, because both Rome and Israel claimed to be an ancient people. Both of them claimed to be a divinely chosen people. The Romans represented themselves as being virtuous, as having a unique history that involved universal rule, bringing civilization and law to the world that would usher in a period of universal peace, the Pax Romana, and a superior legal order. And this, in many ways, is how the Bible begins to present Israel, certainly by the time of the book of Isaiah, right? That Israel is also going to be a light to the nations. It's going to bring Torah, law, if you will, right? Civilization under law, which is what the Romans claim to do. They are understood themselves to be bringing Torah, to be ushering in an era of world peace. So the rabbis saw the Romans as rivals, and this, I'm really quoting here the title of a recent book on the topic, on how the rabbis perceived Rome. They were rivals who claimed to offer benefits to humankind, the very ones that Israel understood itself to be offering. And they had to wonder, they had to be anxious, right? After all, the Romans had destroyed Jerusalem, had actually built a temple on the site of the Jerusalem temple. And they were claiming many of the things. And you had to wonder, maybe we got it wrong. Maybe it was Esav and not Jacob. Right? This had to be anxiety producing in the middle of the history as it's unfolding. And the rabbis certainly reject Rome's understanding of itself. They saw the Romans as being barbarian and cruel and ruthless and sexually licentious and unjust. They saw Roman law as unjust and corrupt and immoral. So they really come in for special treatment in rabbinic literature, right? The Greeks in the previous one, they're just soldiers. They're an enemy army. We don't want them. We don't like them. But the Romans are really vilified and represented as just the utter depth of moral depravity and everything that Israel is not, even though, and perhaps because, they claim to be the very things that Israel thought were true for it, you know?
Okay, so we're living somewhere between a sense of revulsion at what a group actually is, and a fear of competition with that group. And I think that is very powerful. I think it's not hard to see that there is competition in the Middle East for who is going to be.
And I'll add to that competing narratives, or sense that the other's narrative is not accurate.
So
the rabbis felt that Rome misrepresented itself.
So the question, sort of the place where I come to, is I ask myself, you know, the same way I mentioned the importance of being able to distinguish between being a soldier and being a terrorist, I ask myself what the limits are when it comes to talking about a civilian population in terms of trying to make those big sweeping distinctions. We are this and they're the opposite of that. We are all good and they are all bad. I think there's a big danger in that, right? It's you actually admitting that each has goodness that can recommend them, I think forces people to come to grips with the tragedy that war actually is, right? And I want to keep both of those very clear in my mind. The ability to actually be repulsed and to be able to compete on the level of, like, what are our morals and what are we supposed to do and what is our destiny, but also the danger of painting everybody with that brush and what that does to you as a person. I think is very dangerous.
Yes. And I think to the first point that you're making about the repulsion, but also the competition, that goes back to the point you made at the beginning about a lion facing a lion, right? How much like Rome do the rabbis have to become to defeat Rome? Or how much like Rome did the ancient Jews have to become to defeat Rome? I mean, that comes up also in the Maccabean context. Do we fight on Shabbat or not, right? How much do we have to violate the Sabbath?
Like a ritual version of that question.
Yeah, a ritual version of that question. Do we have to violate some of our principles in order to take on this enemy? So how do we keep our values intact? If I can be permitted a brief description of a text in Bavli Pesachim, it's actually a very funny text. I think it's a parody. Some of our listeners may not know that one a punching bag for the rabbis is King David. He's greatly respected by the rabbis in many instances, but they also do make fun of him and his weakness in the whole Bathsheba affair. And there's a very, I think, a parody text. It's funny, but it's also very chilling in Bavli Psachim, and it's describing a feast in the eschaton, in the eschatological age. All of the biblical patriarchs and various heroes are gathered at this feast, and at the end of the meal, someone has to take up the cup of blessing. And so they pass it to Abraham, and he says, "Oh, no, I couldn't possibly, I'm not good enough to do this because, I had a wicked son, Ishmael." And then they pass it to Isaac. He says, "No, I don't merit, I can't do this because I also had a wicked son." Jacob says, "Really, I'm not fit to raise the cup of blessing because I married two sisters, and I know it wasn't a sin in my day, but later it would be." And it continues down the line. And then they get to David, and David said, "Sure, I'll recite the blessing, and it is fitting for me to recite it,
And it's
Absolutely.
ironic.
It's painful and ironic, because he is the adulterer, he is the murderer, the very things that they just said of Esav in our Midrash, right?
Yeah.
Who is this Esav? Who is Rome? They're the ones who are sexually licentious. Esav is represented as being a rapist of a betrothed woman as well as a murderer. David is the most Roman-like figure in the Bible, at least in the rabbis' imagination. The rabbis are constantly telling us about Rome, descended from Edom, who is a murderer and a rapist. And so in many ways, they paint David also as the most Roman-like figure. He's militaristic. He's Machiavellian in his rise to power. And yet he's the one who will take up the cup at the eschatological feast. And I can't help but see the rabbis here as wondering in this sort of pained and tragic way, what Roman-like behavior has the potential to do to Israel, and David did adopt some of that. And certainly the rabbis are willing to see him as having adopted some of that behavior. And I think in stories like that and in midrashim like this, they worry that the nation and its values might be transformed or deformed by the confrontation with Roman power. And that's a worry that is perpetual and universal. And we need to always have this worry.
You want to know something interesting, Chris? So I went up to my nephew the other day at my other nephew's wedding, and I said, "Listen, I want permission to quote you on the podcast." And he said, "Could you tell me about what the podcast is about?" And so I told him, and he goes, "I don't need a midrash to know that."
Wow.
He's like, "Who needs a midrash to know that?"
Right.
And I said, people who haven't been in war need ways to think about it and to hold it.
And they need to know how complicated it is. And they need to know that that's what goes through the mind of a soldier when they're doing some of those things, the ones that I've spoken to at least, and for a different war, actually, many years ago. But that same thing, knowing I'm doing what I have to do, I'm killing a terrorist, but at the same time, there is blood on my hands, and I don't know what I've become. And that's just a very human response. And God forbid we shouldn't have that response. What would that say about us if we didn't have that response?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to end. That's what we'll leave it, and wish everybody a joyous Hanukkah. So thanks for listening to our show, and special thanks to my chavruta this week, Christine Hayes. Texting is produced by Tessa Zitter with production assistance from Gabe Scherzer. Our senior producer is M. Lewis Gordon, and our executive producer is Maytal Friedman. This episode was mixed by Ben Azevedo at Bear Cave Audio, with music provided by Luke Allen. We're always looking for ideas for what we should cover in future episodes. So if you have a topic that you'd like to hear about, or if you have comments about this episode, please write to us at texting@shalomhartman.org. For more ideas from the Shalom Hartman Institute, sign up for our newsletter in the show notes and subscribe to this podcast everywhere podcasts are available. See you next time, and thanks for listening.